Hello and welcome to another episode of Disruption Dialogue Season 2. I'm Sarwant Singh, President and Chief Commercial Officer at Markets and Markets. Today, I'm in conversation with my colleague, Lynne Goulding, who is heading our foresighting team at Markets and Markets. And we'll be talking about some very exciting things about what the future holds for us. We're going to talk about our foresighting program and show you some of our analysis on how we leverage foresighting and how we support our clients in thinking about the future and being future ready. Whenever I do a foresighting presentation, I always start with this slide. We cannot predict the future, but we can invent it. There's another very interesting saying from Bill Gates, which says we always overestimate the next 2 years, but we underestimate the next 8. And that's really typical of what we do as humans. And the objective here for us today is to help you pick up what that future looks like and then do a macro to micro of it.
So thanks, Sarwant. So it was a great introduction. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about how we view foresight within Markets and Markets. So the first thing to say is that it's quite important to differentiate between foresight and forecasting. So as a market research firm, we do a lot of forecasting, a lot of market studies across industries, but at the end of the day, forecasting kind of extrapolates past data into the future. Now, foresight is a little bit more creative and a little bit more strategic. We help clients think about the longer term future in a more creative way. And we do this in a very systematic way. It's also a very participatory process. So we work with our clients to translate what the trends mean for their business. So it's very future oriented. And really the aim of foresight is to avoid being trapped in a business as usual mindset. If you just go on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about our tools and methodologies that we use. So the first is horizon scanning. And the goal of horizon scanning is to identify and anticipate potential opportunities and threats on the horizon. So we have a very systematic process for scanning for trends, issues, and weak signals. Trends research and analysis is a little bit more of a deeper dive into these trends. So it can be a singular deep dive or it can be an ongoing process. And we look at a little bit more detail. For example, it might be looking at what autonomous world means for your organization. And we can do a deep dive. We've done some work for airport clients, for example, looking at how autonomy impacts airports on airside and landside. Visioning is really the first step in creating a powerful strategy. So the purpose of visioning is to provide a shared aspirational goal to guide decision making. And our next methodology, which is backcasting, is a method that involves working backwards from that desired future outcome to identify the steps, actions, and strategies necessary to achieve that preferred future. Scenario planning is a great tool for dealing with uncertainty. So in times we are in now where, geopolitical trends, for example, are very uncertain as well as some longer range technological trends, it's really useful to do scenario planning. They're basically descriptions of how the future may develop. For example, highly uncertain trends like quantum computing or even an economic trend like the end of growth would be great to use in scenarios to understand what that means in terms of how those trends are going to diverge in the future. And then the last one is macro to micro, which we use a lot in Markets and Markets. And this is really a participatory process where we help organizations develop a growth pipeline, so a pipeline of opportunities based on our trends. If you go to the next slide, Sarwant, you'll see that we have 12 mega trends that we track. And we track trends across social, technological, economic, environmental, and political domains. So, tech trends like hyperconnected world, and technology singularity, which is looking at AI. And I know, Sarwant, you're going to expand on these in a little bit. But we also, look at trends that are the underlying drivers, which are often social or geopolitical trends. And we also cover sustainability. In the next slide, we look at how our trends are organized by horizon. So horizon 1 trends are trends we are aware of and understand. They are kind of current trends or in the next 1 to 3 years. Horizon 2 trends are a little bit further out, say in the next 3 to 8 years. And Horizon 3 trends are even further out, and they are highly uncertain. So generally, your current focus might be entirely on Horizon 1 trends, which is business as usual, and less on Horizon 2 and 3 trends. But without a clear view to Horizon 2 trends, which Markets and Markets have a lot of research on, and some knowledge of Horizon 3 trends, your business might be susceptible to disruption. So that's kind of how we frame our horizon scanning tools. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the macro to micro process is really starting with disruptive trends or megatrends, understanding the sub-trends, and then starting to define what the implications and opportunities are as a result of those trends. And I think, Sarwant, at the end, we'll give a few examples of how we use this macro to micro process. So I'll hand over to you for the first trend.
Thank you very much, Lynne. Let me walk you through a few trends, and Lynne and I will share them. So the first trend we have is what we call hyperconnected world. We believe we'll be connected everywhere. We'll be connected at our homes through next generation broadband technologies like Wi-Fi 8, Wi-Fi 10, and Li-Fi, which is quite disruptive. Imagine your light bulbs emitting or actually transmitting data at the speed of light. I mean, that's a scenario very much possible in the future. We'll also have very much cellular connectivity. We'll move from 5G to 5.5G and 6G. Some of you may remember those 1G phones. If you are as old as me, if you carried one of those, you would not need to go to the gym. It was like carrying a brick and literally burning 2,000 calories carrying them. But as we went to 2G, we found cellular, 3G found data, 4G found video, and 5G, as we see, is bringing machine-to-machine communication. It is bringing in things like connected home, connected factories, connected stadiums, but they're still isolated solutions. When we move to 6G, we see that we will come to what we call a connected living solution. As much as we'll have connectivity on the ground, we'll also have connectivity in space. We will launch over 20,000 satellites over the period 2020 to 2030, compared to last decade where we launched about 1,500 satellites. We will have satellite broadband speeds at about 5G in the future. We'll have a lot more accurate positioning systems. So with this, we will move to what we call a super hyper-connected world. And thanks to Space Jam, we might even take space holidays. We will see vertiports and spaceports coming in the future, which provide both horizontal and vertical takeoff and landing. As I was mentioning, we will move from what we have isolated solutions to a connected living. So what is connected living? So connected living is we are connected at a personal level. So these could be our homes, our appliances, our healthcare and workspace. We'll be connected at a community level. So these could be utilities in the future, transport, logistic hubs, retail hubs, but also at a city level. That means all the infrastructure in a city. But the important thing is, and in the future, all of these three will be absolutely seamless. Now let's do a macro to micro of this and say, okay, what does it mean, for example, to the car industry? We believe the car industry, which all of us already call mobile on wheels, will have all of these connected living solutions being embedded in the vehicle in the future. So if you look at our analysis here, there are 12 different elements of your en route mobility service. And these will all be integrated. So things like your smart home, your smart energy solutions, your drive, your workplace, everything will be part and embedded and triggered through the vehicle of the future. Let's move to our next trend.
Just before you move on to the next trend, a quick question on connected living. We have, some examples of 5G in the consumer space, such as 5G in stadiums, enabling immersive experiences. How do you see 5G being used in the industrial market?
Absolutely. We see the growth of 5G factories. Already there are some examples. For example, in the auto industry, we know General Motors, BMW are putting 5G factories. I think the future of manufacturing will be very different. And for example, for that, you will need super hyper connected factories through 5G, but also through the cloud. Thank you, Lynne. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about technology singularity or artificial intelligence. We believe thanks to generative AI, we moved from narrow AI to general AI. And super AI is something which is still far away. We believe our brain, which is super AI, the machines today are only replicating 1 or 2% of that. So there's still a long way to go. With generative AI, we saw quite a bit of hype last year. I believe that generative AI is still a long way to go. At the moment, if you look at the roadmap, we are only working on text and coding. In the future, generative AI will also enable images, video, 3D gaming, some examples we are already seeing. And it'll also enable a number of use cases across sectors. The way we sort of cluster those use cases, we believe initial use cases will be just simple user. The way we cluster those use cases, we believe the first one would be just simple productivity gains. Like my son, he cheats on his homework. He goes on Chat GPT and does half his homework there. Similarly, we are using that for marketing, for example. In future, we see efficiency improvements. So instead of feeding the data into a traditional AI, we feed it into a generative AI. And that means 3, 5, 10% improvement in efficiency. For example, we were doing a case study where an oil company could, maybe thanks to generative AI, generate 1 or 2 barrels of oil a day more. Now, you might say that's not enough. But if you look at what that means over the 365 days in a year, that's significant improvement in efficiency. And eventually, as we move towards 2030, and based on my last slide, we will see improvements in innovation. For example, drug delivery or development, or for example, automotive car industry development. Both industries spend about $1 billion in developing a new drug or developing a new vehicle. If you can shave 3 months to 2 years as part of that process, you could reduce costs by about 10 to 30%. So that's what we will see is generative AI supporting a lot in innovation and in product development. Thanks to generative AI, we are seeing companies like NVIDIA now become the largest and the most capitalized company in terms of valuation. We're also seeing a huge surge in industries like data centers. Data centers consume today about 1.5% to 2% of the global energy. This will grow to about 3% to 4% in the future. So again, when we look at these technologies, we look at these trends, and something that we find when you work on trends, they're always connected. So, growth in artificial intelligence is having an impact on the energy market. One very exciting thing we will see, and Bill Gates talks about, is this growth or change from bots to agents. Today, we have lots of bots helping us. Literally, all the contact centers are being now replaced by bots. In the future, we'll have agents. So maybe if I want to meet Lynne for a coffee, my agent will talk to Lynne's agent, or in other words, an agent is a digital assistant. So the digital assistant of our digital assistants will talk to each other and set up our meeting and even define which place to meet and put it in our diary, and also coordinate through various other apps to ensure that we take the right transport, or we can share our journeys if we are running late. So very exciting what we will see. What we'll also see in future is agents not just being used in consumer applications, but also in business-to-business applications. For example, helping support with your ERP systems in the future. So where does this take us? Where does artificial intelligence take us? We believe one of the future scenarios, which Lynne talked about, is autonomous world. We believe this is a $10 trillion opportunity in the future, and we will see a lot more level 3, level 4 autonomous vehicles, and also autonomy in other sectors, like, for example, in healthcare. We will also see autonomy, for example, in wheelchairs. Lynne and I worked for a client, which was an airport, and they had 8,000 wheelchairs as part of let me do that again. Lynne and I worked for a client, which was an airport client, and we worked with them on the theme of autonomous world. And they identified that they have something like 8,000 wheelchairs. And for each wheelchair, they literally have a human pushing that wheelchair. Now imagine if these wheelchairs were autonomous, what it means for the airport, but most important, how liberating experience it is for the customer. In future, our airspace could be very busy. As you can see here, we might have to chop our airspace into multiple clusters. So we could have drones flying in at 500 to 1,000 feet. And we could also have hypersonic travel at 50 or 60,000 feet. And this could be the future of Formula One. So there's just a vehicle and no driver. And this could be what buildings could look like in future. We could take off and land from high-rise buildings in the future. Again, Lynne did this piece of work on future of airports. And Lynne, tell me, you found that airports in the future will also support these eVTOLs?
Absolutely, Sarwant. Yeah, it's kind of a natural progression for airports. They've got a lot of the systems in place that it makes it relatively easy to integrate eVTOLs within the airport ecosystem, and it is something that a lot of airports are currently looking at as a way to increase sort of aeronautical and non-aeronautical revenue.
Interesting, Lynn. I was once in Sao Paulo, and I could book a Uber helicopter there for $80. Now that's not a lot. In London, I pay £50 just for going 5 miles. Imagine if I could do that in the future, and my airport journey or any journey could be cheap, but also at the same time, could take out all that congestion from our roads in urban cities. That means also, we're seeing new computing science come in. So if you remember my first slide of this section, where we talk about how we would move from general to super AI, it's technologies like quantum computing, neuromorphic computing, and DNA computing, which will help enable that. Our next trend is what we call Industry 5.0. When we found molecules, it gave rise to mechanical revolution, which happened not far from where I live here in the UK. And then when we found electrons and we found fossil fuels, it gave rise to Industry 2.0, mass production. Ford led that revolution, so you could buy any car as long as it was a black Model T. And then came automation, then came Industry 4.0, which is where we sit today with digital manufacturing. In the future, we see digital manufacturing along with sustainability, AI, moving away from mass production to mass personalization and customization. And in future, the Industry 5.0, as we see it, means 5G factories. We talked about it briefly. We see 3D printing, and we see manufacturing metaverse, where things like digital twin, AR, VR, cognitive configurators, and factories in a cloud, enabling them to be connected completely globally, but also completely connected with the customers and the whole value chain, right from a customer ordering through a cognitive configurator all the way to delivery being absolutely seamless. We also see a big shift in business models. Most business models today are CapEx based. In future, Industry 5.0 business models might be very OpEx based. We see the integration of and combination of OT, IT, ET, and IIoT in developing platform as a service business models. Lynn, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sure, Sarwant. So just before I go on to the next trend, just a quick question there. We speak quite a lot about Industry 5.0 as an emerging trend, but are we seeing any examples of Industry 4.0 currently?
There are, Lynn, you're right. I think there's been a bit of a hype on Industry 4.0. Yeah. But we are seeing some first examples. The best one I take off is Volkswagen Group. This organization, which is the largest manufacturing organization in the world, they have capacity to build over 11 million cars. They have multiple brands, over 100 factories. They came together with Amazon, Siemens, and other companies and put everything on a cloud. So they've set up the first manufacturing cloud, and that's always the first step to setting up Industry 4.0. Just like Volkswagen leads with economies of scale and synergies between platform, this Industry 4.0 will really help them bring that together and to also enable future of manufacturing, which I believe will be very different from what it is today.
Thanks, Sarwant. So I will just move on to our next trend, which is baby bust economies. So basically, we know that emerging economies will outpace advanced economies in growth. So in this chart, you can see that the G7 economies are basically flatlining a little bit. And this is largely because developing economies have growing populations and a young demographic. So by 2040, today's developing economies will account for about 65% of global output. So India is significant due to its large population and growing economy. But also, it's an interesting fact that 9 of the 20 fastest growing economies worldwide in 2024 will be in Africa. There's also an interesting outlier that I was reading about earlier, which is Guyana. This country has a GDP forecast this year of 34% due to an oil and gas boom. So, it's interesting to see, watch these emerging economies and where the growth is taking place. If you just go on to the next slide, Sarwant, one of the things we believe is that countries with 100 million or more population have the potential to be trillion-dollar economies by 2040. So if you look at how, the economies change over time, the size of them, by 2050, we see India's moved up to third position, and China has overtaken the US. It may even be by this point that the US falls below India in 2050. And what this means is it will result in new rules for a new world, including a shake-up of the world's economic institutions and geopolitical relations. And so we like to talk about one of our Horizon 3 trends, which is end of growth. So this is a bit further into the future, but basically as global population growth slows to zero and climate change accelerates, could we start to see the end of growth? Or will the growing middle class in developing countries be enough to drive future growth? Regardless, these changing dynamics will pose challenges for business over the longer term. So I will hand over back to you.
It frightens me, Lynne, when you talk about end of growth. But it is a scenario very much possible. If you look at some of the economies like Germany, in future, if they have population is declining, could they become like what Japan has been? We've seen Japan has, had a very challenging time over the last few years. And exactly. If some of the growing economies like India, China stop growing in 30, 40, 50 years, how does the world look like?
Yeah, I think India is expected to peak in 2064, somewhere around there. So beyond that, it could be interesting to see what happens.
Of course, I think India is going to be a huge growth story in the next 5 to 6 years. And as we know, it'll leapfrog into third place, take over from Germany and Japan over this in this decade. Let's look at future of energy. We believe future of energy will be decarbonized, decentralized, digital, and democratized. So we see when we talk about decarbonization, new fuels or new sources of energy like hydrogen, electrification. We also see much more decentralized. I think Australia once talked about that they will not build any large mega power plants, but they will focus on decentralization. I think digitization will improve efficiency. And what we also see, which is the last trend here, is democratization. What do we mean by that? We mean that, for example, markets or countries like Saudi Arabia, which have rich sunlight, but also huge fossil fuels, you combine those two and they could absolutely very much be the leaders, for example, in green hydrogen. What we also see, peak oil. I mean, this is an interesting slide, and you can see how varied the world is. Looks like very diverse opinion. So if you look at the opinion from OPEC, they're saying it's not going to run out and we will go from 100 million barrels a day to 120 or more. But then you have the doomsday scenario from IEC talking about going down to 20 million. I don't think that's going to be also a case today. I think we'll see a lot more resilience of the fossil fuels. But we believe somewhere around 2028, 2030, as electric vehicles are about 30% of global sales, you will see use of oil as a transport being reduced, but certain elements like crude to chemicals perhaps growing. So we believe somewhere around 2028, 2030, this decade, you might see peak oil come in. And we see very much a growth of renewables, especially in countries, and particularly if you look at this analysis, developing countries are even overtaking some of the mature countries, like India could have about 400 gigawatts, China about 1,800 gigawatts. And you compare that to Germany, will only have 248 gigawatts. Even Brazil is expected to have 400 gigawatts. One other big energy source which we feel will be very exciting in the future is hydrogen. We believe hydrogen will be an important source of energy. It will be used in multiple applications, including chemicals, industrial, but also as a fuel in transport in the future. And particularly if we talk about liquid hydrogen, that's quite exciting. We believe by 2035, 20% of all hydrogen produced could be potentially green. But one of the things that we see with hydrogen is the business model will be very different. We will not be moving hydrogen from Australia to, example, Rotterdam, like we do with LPG and CNG. I mean, it's just too expensive. It's almost 100% of the cost of development is the 100% of the cost of transportation of hydrogen. So we might see micro hydrogen economies. Imagine a port or an airport being a source of generation of hydrogen, but also consumption of hydrogen on source. So it's exciting times for hydrogen in the future as we also see prices declining. Our next trend is on future of mobility. We see 4 different scenarios of mobility, from using multiple different powertrains and then to 2025. Post 2025, we see the car becoming very much an IoT platform. We will see level 3 and level 4 autonomy coming into the vehicles. Post 2030 is when we see level 4 autonomy coming in. I'm not sure I expect to see level 5 over the next 10. Level 5 is when you can get in a car and travel, for example, from London to Leeds, and you can watch a movie and there is no steering wheel or a braking paddle in the vehicle. I think we'll see a scenario where we'll go in vehicles from hands off, feet off to completely brain off. And that's level 5, which is brain off. But I think that's still, in my opinion, 10 or 15 or more years away. And in the future, we'll also see what we call transcendental mobility, something we discussed in our autonomous world trend, where we could see hypersonic travel coming in. We could see eVTOLs coming in. And we could also see large, very high-speed trains, like bullet trains, even faster at 300 to 400 kilometers an hour coming in. But I think the most important thing when it comes to mobility is everybody talks about is, when will fossil fuels be overtaken by electric vehicles? We believe that time will be somewhere around 2036, 37. By end of this decade, I think we believe 30% of all vehicles sold will be electric. In certain segments, like in two-wheelers or in urban buses, this could even be 100% by 2030. Over to you, Lynne, to talk a little bit about our shifting demographics.
Sure. So I think demographic trends are always interesting from an underlying driver perspective, because they do, tend to drive a lot of other trends. So we know that future society will be more heterogeneous in terms of age, wealth, and culture. And basically what this means is it will require more personalized services from companies. And also we'll see changing consumer preferences. So for example, Gen Z and Gen Alpha may be a lot more health conscious in the future. They might avoid meat and sugar, etc. What is not on the slide is Gen Alpha, which is the youngest generation. But we know that by 2025, Gen Alpha are expected to number more than 2 billion. And this is a generation that is growing up with tech such as AI and connected living. And so we will see them driving things like the autonomous world that you've mentioned, Sarwant. Another trend is aging population. Over 65s will count for about a quarter of the developed world's population by 2040. And this has a number of impacts on businesses and design as well. Seeing women as a customer, so new customers being targeted by companies to expand their offering. Just looking at the next slide, expanding a little bit more on the middle class, the rise of the middle class. So currently around 140 million people are joining the middle class every year. And the largest majority of new entrants into the middle class, so about 88% of the next billion, will live in Asia. So you can see from this chart that European and North American middle class basically starts to stagnate. And because middle class spending accounts for about 1/3 of the global economy, this has big regional implications. So, for example, one of the implications we've seen through our Future of Airport study is that we're seeing air travel explode in the APAC region. And this is largely driven by the rise of the middle class. And we're seeing something similar happening in Africa. Although, the base is a lot smaller, so the expansion in market size is limited, but we're still seeing large growth. And on that subject, even though Sarwant thinks I'm being a bit biased as a South African here, but it's really interesting, actually, the growth in Africa. So especially in terms of urbanization. So by the end of the century, about 13 out of 20, so 65% of the largest megacities will be in Africa. And what this means is that about 60 to 80% of the built environment that will be needed by 2050 to support the growing population is still to be built. This opens up a huge opportunity for infrastructure, especially in cities, to be done better than in the developed world. For example, it could be done more in a more green way, more nature-based solutions, or, for example, designing cities less focused on cars. So, it's also interesting just in terms of the sheer growth in numbers of Africans that in the future, it's likely that you will employ an African in your workforce. So some of the largest global companies like Google, Microsoft, Meta, they've all deployed in Africa to capitalize on this talent surge because of the growing young population. So I'm going to hand back to you, Sarwant, to talk a little bit about healthcare.
And although I'm not biased about Africa, I think it's the final frontier. And if you look at the amount of urbanization in that region and the population growth, I definitely agree. I think it will maybe negate that end of growth trend, that trend that you talk about, Lynn. Talking about healthcare, if you ask me, what is the mega trend of all of the future, I would say it's healthcare. And the reason it is because we are getting older. 1 in 5 of us will live over 100. They say the person who will live up to 150 is already born. And what we also see is the healthcare spending growing. So if you look at countries like US, it's already touching 20% of GDP. And in most other countries, as we get older and we live longer and we have more chronic diseases, this will become a challenge. At the same time, we also have extremes like in India and Turkey, where healthcare spending is so low. So, how do you sustain this model? Our view is the healthcare model will shift from, and is already shifted, is from finding it and fixing it and going to hospitals to more around prevention, around wellness and well-being. So we see things like value-based care coming in, efficiency being most important. And instead of going and getting fixed in hospitals, we will see a lot more alternate sides of care. And I think the most important what we talk about is what we call the quantified patient. The patient in the future, thanks to all these amazing devices we have. I was diagnosed as pre-diabetes and I had this lovely little chip on my body, which could tell me exactly based on what I eat, what my glucose sugar levels are in a day. So that's what we will see in the future, technology working with doctors very much to prevent diseases as opposed to fixing it when you are ill. My most important preferred megatrend, if you ask me, Lynn, is what I call innovating to zero. To me, it's more a mega vision than a megatrend. What it means is how about we have a world where we have carbon neutral cities, carbon neutral factories, but most importantly, zero hunger, zero malnutrition. Or within the car industry, we have cars that emit zero emissions. There are zero accidents. There are zero congestions in the world. So I think this is, to me, is the future world that we are all aiming for in terms of CSR. And if you may remember, we've done a few projects where one of my favorite ones was where we worked for a client to help them develop zero malnutrition in kids through the biscuits or cookies that they build. And they were able to achieve it as part of their products. And their product became the #1 selling biscuit because of this zero vision that they put in place. So within our within our foresighting team, we help clients use foresight in a number of ways. We use foresighting to help them look for growth opportunities, create an innovation pipeline. We help them understand things when they're fundamentally changing. For example, geopolitics, how does that impact you and your business? How do you future-proof your business using it? But also we help them with some softer things like training your visionary or training your leaders to become visionary in the future, but also helping you look at the uncertainties and risks that you might have and how do you respond to those risks, for example. We have done a number of consulting engagements. Here is an example where we supported a client, which is a FTSE 100 company here in the UK. We worked with all their divisions and regions and supported them to identify growth opportunities. It was quite a collaborative process. We did workshops in 5 regions. We identified a long list and short list of opportunities. And then we ran a very interesting Dragon's Den exercise. I don't know if you've seen Dragon's Den, but it's a bit like Shark Tank, where you have to pitch an idea as an entrepreneur, and if that idea gets selected, you get funding for it. So that's what we did here, and the client was very excited and identified and took all the 10 opportunities that we shortlisted for them into the next phase. Another interesting project we did was for a company which is mainly in automotive, but also other areas, and they took our foresighting work to develop a pipeline of new opportunities. And we were able to create 9 innovation clusters for them in healthcare, in robotics, in new energy sources. And within those 9 clusters, they were able to shortlist 36 technologies that they will focus on as part of their innovation pipeline and as part of their technology planning. So, Lynn, that brings me to the end of the presentation. Anything you'd like to talk about or share as part of your foresighting experience?
Just to say, so when talking about those case studies, I think the participatory aspect is something that's, really important, because ultimately our clients are the experts in their industries and their areas. So, our workshop we ran last week was really interesting in terms of some of the very technical opportunities they came up with. And, that was through us being able to facilitate the discussion and the tools we use, but they really came up with opportunities that were relevant to them at a very granular micro level.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. You're absolutely spot on. I mean, we facilitated, we bring the ideas, but it's your industry, it's your market. You need to learn how to apply that and understand what that means in terms of opportunity, but also what challenges and risks it brings. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Lynn, for this this presentation today. Thanks to everybody for listening in. I was in conversation with Lynne Goulding, who is our foresighting expert and leads our foresighting team. Lynn, thank you once again. Stay tuned for such interesting episodes on Disruption Dialogues.
Thanks for tuning in. If you want to know how you can navigate and thrive in this disruptive era, subscribe to Disruption Dialogues on your go-to podcast channels and stay tuned for more interesting episodes.